So let's talk about pattern creation. And there are three basic ways of going about creating patterns, and that's procedurally, through painting, and through photo manipulation. And we'll start first with the general patterns. So procedurals are algorithmically defined patterns, and most pieces of software have some basic procedurals built in. Like in Macs, there's noise and smoke and dent, and a bunch of others. There's also some third-party applications like Darktree, which is made by DarkSim that lets you make procedurals. There's also the Essential Textures by Digimation, which is a Max plugin. And then later on, I'm going to discuss a script that I wrote called the TextMap Preview, which is a useful tool for visualizing procedurals in 3D Studio Max. So the advantages of procedurals is, first of all, they have an unlimited resolution, so no matter how close you get to them, there's always more detail. It's pretty easy and fast to create a complex pattern. It's easy to change some features, like, for example, the overall size of the pattern with one button click, which is more difficult using the other methods. And it also takes up less memory than large bitmaps. But disadvantage-wise, first of all, it's difficult to get a complex look without layering lots of procedurals together or programming your own. And it's sometimes slower to compute than a bitmap because it has to calculate a big algorithm instead of just looking up the color in your bitmap. And it's also generally more difficult to anti-alias than a bitmap, which means potentially longer render times, or you might end up getting some sparkling effects. So now, painting-wise, this is using brushes in a piece of paint software to create a digital pattern. And most people tend to use Photoshop for this, although some people use Painter by Corel, and some people use ZBrush by Pixelogic. So the advantages of using painting is you can get the pattern to look exactly how you want it to. It's sometimes faster to calculate than a procedural because the final color is read from a bitmap, and it's easier to anti-alias than a procedural. But disadvantage-wise, it takes a lot of time to do painting compared to a procedural, although the use of custom brushes can help speed up this process. Also, your resolution is not unlimited, so you have to pick a res and then stick with it. So if you don't have a high enough resolution and you get too close to it, you're going to have to repaint everything. And then larger bitmaps take up more memory than most procedurals do. So photo manipulation is the art of taking photos and editing them to get the result you want. Many times this is combined with manual painting in a paint program. And one little note I want to make is that if you do take photos for using in photo manipulation, I highly recommend taking the photos on a cloudy day, because then you have far fewer lighting artifacts that exist in the image that you'll have to deal with later. So the main piece of software people use for to do this is Adobe Photoshop. It has a bunch of advantages again. You can start from something realistic right off the bat, which can get you a good chunk of the way there quickly. Sometimes it's faster to calculate than procedurals, and it's easier to anti-alias than a procedural, just like the painted stuff. So the disadvantage is that you have to remove artifacts from your photos, and that can take time. So for example, you may have to remove lighting information that comes with your photo because the lighting information is going to be provided by your 3D program, and you don't want it baked into the texture. Also, you have to have a photo of what you want in order to get a result. So if you can't get a photo of what you want, then you're out of luck. You have to remove specific details from the photo sometimes, especially if you're making tileable textures, and that can take time. Your resolution, once again, is not unlimited, and large bitmaps take up more memory than many procedurals. So now let's talk about specific patterns. And it's the same three ways to create them: procedurally, painting, and photo manipulation. And it's the same advantages and disadvantages, but there's just a few notes that are specific to creating specific patterns. So first of all, if you want to use procedurals, the only real program that can do this is a program called MapZone. And that's because it gives you a certain degree of control over the placement of details. But for most procedurals, it's really difficult to place a specific detail exactly where you want it. And that's the reason that I don't usually recommend using procedurals for specific patterns, unless they're going to be enhanced with painting. Like, for example, you bake out the procedural into a 2D bitmap and then paint over top of it in Photoshop. Now for painting, you can use 3D paint programs like the 2D paint programs to do specific painting. And these programs are stuff like ZBrush, Body Paint 3D, Deep Paint 3D, which I believe is discontinued, Mudbox 2, and Modo. So in general, I don't recommend using a 3D paint program for general patterns, but they're really useful for specific patterns because you can paint directly onto your model in 3D. And then finally, for photo manipulation, unlike general patterns, since you're probably not going to make tileable textures when you're doing a specific pattern, you don't have to have the disadvantage of painting out the specific details to avoid visual repetition. So anyway, as you can see, there are advantages and disadvantages to each of these three techniques, and so my personal recommendation is to use all three of these and to try to use the advantages of each for different situations when it comes to creating your patterns. So a few words on procedurals. First of all, it's reasonably common. I'll go on CG Talk and somebody asks some sort of texturing question, and somebody will come on and say, well, you really want to hand paint everything because procedurals suck and you really shouldn't use them. Now, I really disagree with this sentiment, and I think sometimes the reason people say that procedurals suck is simply because they've seen them used incorrectly too many times. And what they really should say is, well, if you're going to use procedurals, you really need to go about layering them and blending them together in order to get something that's more visually pleasing. Now, I love hand painting, and I do it all the time, and I also do photo manipulation, but procedurals really do have their place. And it's a shame that sometimes they get discarded without really, looking into whether they'd be appropriate for the situation or not. So, sometimes someone will just be starting out and they will take an object and they'll apply a material, and maybe they'll just stick a noise in the bump or something, and then they'll hit render, and that's it. And that's as far as they go. And now, if your final result looks like this, I can understand why somebody might say, well, it's not looking very good. But it's not the procedural that's not looking good. It's just that it was applied in too simple a manner. And if you spend the time, you can really get something that does look much more realistic than something simple like this. So this is Darktree, which is a procedural pattern generator. And I'm going to make a rock material. This is just the color, using a bunch of procedurals and layering them together. So for example, here's a clouds procedural and a pumice, and then you mix those together, and then this result and the fractal are mixed together with a rough, so the black areas show one of these and the white areas show the other. And then that mixture I'm mixing with some blobs to put some speckles in there. And then we have a whole nother setup here of fractals and clouds combining with more fractals and more clouds, all at different sizes. And then the final two results here are mixed together to get the final texture. Now let's look at this far more complex rock, which I have applied that color map to. You can see inside of here I have the Darktree color map in the diffuse, and just a simple noise in the bump. But then the other area I'm using procedurals is to do this displacement, which you can see here. And again, it's all about mixing stuff. So I have in here a noise, which is then applied, masked by a second kind of noise, and this is added to another composite mode, and this is a combination of a bunch of different noises, which is then mixed with a cellular, and this is all connected. And if you look at this object here and turn off the displacement, this is just a simple sphere. So all of the shape of your rock is coming from the procedurals that I've made up. And then if we render this guy, you see we've come up with something that looks far more realistic and far more visually interesting than that initial rock. And it's all thanks to layering a bunch of procedurals together. Now, as far as the texture on this goes, you don't have to go the procedural route. You could have, for example, modeled a far more complex rock and then applied a texture that you painted or got from some sort of photograph of real rocks. And, sometimes that's the appropriate thing to do. But if you have a whole ton of rocks, like maybe 1,000 different rocks, you can apply one procedural material to all of them, and you can get variety that otherwise would have to be painted on each rock, or at least a whole bunch of different rocks so people wouldn't notice the repeating pattern. So it's areas like that that I think procedurals are really useful. And now, if you don't like using them and you really love hand painting, then, do whatever works for the particular situation you're dealing with. But I really think that you shouldn't discount procedurals right off the bat as not being a good solution, because they really can be useful in a lot of situations, as long as they're used in the right way. So now just a quick little tutorial on a method that I have for visualizing procedurals much quicker inside of 3D Studio. So say you have a material, which is assigned here, and you have in the color map a bitmap, and you want to see what it's going to look like without having to do a full render. So you can just turn on the show map in viewport, and there you go. So now if you render this, you'll see that the results in the render are pretty similar to the results in your view. So if you want to edit this in the view, you can do so, and you're pretty much guaranteed that it'll look right when rendered. But now let's say you have a procedural noise in your color right here, and you apply this material to the object, and you can see here that you can see the map also here, and you might change it various values, and then you hit render, and you'll notice that the render looks nothing like what's in the viewport. Like in the viewport has these like stretchy black things, and they don't appear there, and it has a big white splotch and it's not there, and a sort of a pinched area up here. So this is a real problem, because you have to render your whole image in order to see what your procedural is going to look like, and this is a problem that a lot of procedurals have in Max. So to solve this problem, I made a script which is called text map preview. And what this does is this lets you preview whatever map you have selected in your material editor on the objects in your scene. So in this case, I will hit apply with this noise map selected, and it'll do a quick render of what the map looks like. And the advantage of this is that this render is really quick. So say you have a scene that takes maybe 5 minutes to render. Rather than render the whole scene, you can just select the map you want to see, hit apply on here, and it'll automatically render out this really quick preview so you can see what your map looks like. So it's not quite as good as seeing the map in your view, but at least it's much faster to render. So there's a bunch of different parameters in here. There's some options to help speed up the process. You can do it on the objects that have the material, as well as selected objects invisible. And then the other useful thing is this lock current active map. So say for a second you go to this material and you hit apply, you'll notice it gives an error. It says please pick a slot that contains a text map. And that's because you're currently selecting a material, not this text map down here. But if you go here and you click lock current active map, it now saves this bitmap as the map you want to look at. So even if you're up here and you hit apply, it'll still render this map right here. Now, the place this becomes really useful is if you have map chains. So say instead of just a noise, you have a mix, and the mix contains a noise, and slot 2 will be a cellular, and then slot 3 is going to be sort of a checker. So it's a checkerboard that blends between your cellular and your noise map. So if you hit apply on this, you see that it's still attached to the noise map. Then if you undo that, it'll do the active texture map, and there's what the active texture map looks like. Now say you want to tweak the size of the cellular, but you want to see the results of the whole map chain. So what you can do is you can say lock current active view, then go down into cellular, and you can change this value to something different and hit apply, and it'll still render the upper level map. So this way you don't have to keep going up and down the chain in order to see the map that you want to see. And this doesn't only work for procedurals, it can also work for anything you put in here, including bitmaps. So it's just a nice, quick, fast way to get a preview, a more accurate preview of exactly what you're going to see when you do your final render, but without having to take as long as the final render might take. Okay, so for this short Photoshop tutorial, I'm going to discuss how I go about making custom brushes for doing grime and dirt on my textures. So the first thing I want to show you is my set of grime brushes, which are up here, and the first thing you'll probably notice is that there's only a few of them in there. And there are a lot of custom brushes out there for doing grime. There's thousands and thousands, and I know some people like collecting every one they possibly can, but overall, most of the texture painting people I know tend to only paint with a few brushes, and it provides most of what they need. So feel free to collect thousands of them if you want to, but I just want to let you know that if you don't collect thousands, that doesn't mean you can't do good work with just a few good all-purpose brushes. So to start off with, most of my brushes start off as being a photograph or something that I've scanned. So for this, I'm going to bring in a photograph. And this is a metal plate that was outside my house. And you'll see it has lots of nice grimy nastiness on it. And so perfect for making a brush. So the first thing I'm going to do is go to Adjustments, and I'm going to desaturate the image, which makes it black and white. Then I'm going to go under Levels, and I'm going to start playing with the levels. And what I'm looking for here is to make this image far more contrasty than it was before. So let's start with something like this. And we don't need the whole image for a brush, so I'm just going to go in and select a smaller area. How about this? In general, I make most of my brushes square because it's just easier to deal with. So here we go, and I'm going to invert the image so that it's now black on white. And the way Photoshop works is anything that's black in a brush will paint the paint, and anything that's white will not paint any paint. So let's just put a little more contrast into this. I think it needs a little more to work for a brush. So maybe something around like this. Yeah, I think that'll work. Okay, so the next thing I need to do is, if you're going to use this for a brush, you need to make sure that the edges don't fall off in a straight line, that they sort of fade off as they go. So the way I tend to do this is I use another brush, dirt brush I've already made, to get rid of the stuff around the edges. But if this is your first brush and you don't already have a grime brush to do this with, you can even use a very simple brush from this. So let's do that. Let's go to Edit and Define Brush Preset, and just pick that. We'll be fine. Now, under Brushes, let's pick that brush, which is down at the bottom, and let's go under the options, and let's change a few of the options. So these are all the options you can apply to the brush that you just made, and we're going to turn on Shape Dynamics. I'm going to turn on the Size Jitter, which changes the size of each brush stroke to be bigger or smaller, and the Angle Jitter, which means that it is going to rotate randomly with each stroke. And under scattering, I'll give it a little bit of scattering, and maybe reduce this a little bit, the count. I'll get more into what these are in a second, but right now my main goal is just to get something random so I can then use that to get rid of the edges to my brush. So hide that, and I'll make this brush a little smaller. I make brushes smaller with the two brackets. That's a real fast way of getting it bigger and smaller. So now I'll change this to white, and I will start getting rid of these edges. So that's pretty good. Maybe I was going to do some cloning there, but I think actually this will probably be good just as is without doing a bunch of cloning in the middle. So now we have this. I can now make another brush from this result. So I'll go under Define Brush Preset. Let's give it a name like Dirt 1. Then we go into our brush options. Again, make sure we have that brush selected, which we do. Go to Shape Dynamics and make sure the Size Jitter is high, the Angle Jitter is high. You can turn on the flip if you want even more randomness. And then under Scattering, scatter it a little bit, and then increase its count to make it a little bit darker. So the way this works is the scatter scatters it in the X and Y direction, and the more it scatters, the further away each individual brushstroke might be from where you're actually painting. So you want just enough that it makes it more random, but not so far that it'll throw a brushstroke in a totally wrong part of the canvas. And then count is a good way to repeat the brush on top of each other, and that will make it darker. So the more of this, the more darker your brush will become. So now let's make a test just to see how this brush looks. And I'll zoom in a little bit. And there's our brush. So it's not too bad. One thing I'm noticing though is that these larger areas, these larger bits of grit are, it's kind of obvious that this is the same grit repeated here and then rotated over here. So what tends to happen is once you made the brush, you might want to look at it and say, okay, well, I think I need to change the original image just a little bit. So obviously the part of the brush that's causing that problem is, for example, that dot there and maybe like these dots here. So just go in and maybe erase those a little bit. Actually, for this, what I'll probably do is I'll switch to a different set of brushes. I am going to use a more regular round brush for getting rid of these little bits here. So got rid of that guy, and these guys here. Maybe a little bit of this stuff over here. Okay, that looks good. I'll go back to my grime brushes back here and select all again. And then define brush preset, call it whatever I want. Go up here, turn on the shape dynamics, which will have a big size, big angle, turn on the flips, go to scattering, and that should be pretty good, and that'll probably be fine for the count. Okay, and then now let's do our test again to see how that looks. And there we go. We have something that is grimy but doesn't have a lot of obvious repeating going on with various patterns. So this is pretty good. I'll be using this later on in part 2 for doing some texture maps. So let's just take this and I'll go under here. Now keep in mind all these changes you made here are not yet saved. These are temporary changes you've made to your original brush. So to save these you have to go to create new brush, which is down here under the options, give it another name, so like say dirt 2, and now when you go here and you grab this brush, that brush has saved the shape dynamics and the scattering that you have, and now you are set to go painting some dirt. So no texturing DVD would be complete without a discussion of how to make tileable textures, and this is something you'll probably be doing quite a lot of. Now I know there's a lot of tutorials out there on the web how to do this, and there's also, most people know about the filter, offset, and clone method to get rid of seams. But hopefully there are a few tricks in here which might help you more quickly make your tileable textures that you haven't seen before. So to start off with, the first thing I'm going to do is show you how to get rid of changes in lighting that occurs on surfaces. So here's some pavement, which was outside my house, and I took a photograph of with my digital camera. So let's say you're going to make this tileable. The first thing you might start doing is go to Filter, go to Other, and then Offset. And offset the image in order to clone away these seams. So the problem, though, you see, is that there's some pretty radically different color changes here. This is very dark, that's lighter, that's even lighter. This is darker, but not as dark as this. So if you go into your clone tool and you start trying to clone stuff away, you'll see that it's going to be really difficult because this area is still different than that area, and if there was only some way to get rid of this large lighting change, things would be a whole lot simpler. So that's exactly what we're going to do. So let's just back up here for a second to our non-offset texture. Now, the way we're going to do this is using the high pass method, which is another filter that lets you get rid of large changes in luminosity without getting rid of the small detail. So the way I like doing this is to start off, I make a new layer. So I have my background layer, and here I'll do duplicate layer. And now I have a copy of the first layer sitting on top of the second layer. Now, this layer, I go to Filter, I go to Other, I go to High Pass, and I then apply the filter. Now you'll notice as the radius gets smaller, more and more small detail disappears, and as you get larger and larger, it gets rid of less and less of the large detail color changes. So you might need to play around with this value a bit. I'm just going to do a value of 50. Try that out and see how that works. So if we now take this layer and we now offset this layer, you'll notice that the color here and here and here, it's pretty similar between each one, and it'll be pretty easy to then get rid of these seams using the clone tool. But the problem is, of course, is this is a radically different color and brightness than the actual photo, which is more darker and bluer. So the way I fix this problem is I take this layer and I change its layer type to luminosity, which means that it'll take the color from this layer, but from this layer it'll take the overall brightness. And then on this layer I will add a mask. And once I add the mask, I'll then just select an area, maybe a rectangular area, and put black in here. And what that does is that lets me see this layer while at the same time seeing what the layer below looks like as far as brightness goes. And this is just a previewing technique I have so you can more closely match these colors by hand. So if you then take this layer, not the mask of the layer, but the layer itself, and go up to Adjustments Levels, you can start adjusting it. And you can see this in the preview area. This is what I want it to kind of look like. So this seems like it's pretty good. Maybe I'll go in and adjust a little more, maybe do a brightness contrast and bring the contrast down a little bit. Yeah, something about like there. And then I get rid of the mask because I don't need it anymore to match. Apply, do not. I just want to delete it. So now you can see that the two different layers look pretty similar as far as color, but the difference being that if you take this layer and you do the offset, you now don't have the radical change that we had before. Now this is ready for the clone tool. So here's another piece of pavement. Similar to the first one, I've already done the brightness correction on this, and we're going to remove the seams that occur at the edge of the texture in order to make it tileable. So to start off with, let's look at the image size. It's about 850 by 850 pixels. So I'll go to Filter, Other, Offset, and I'll move it about halfway. So about 425 by 425 pixels. Make sure wraparound is on. Hit OK, and now in the center of our image we see we have our seam that we want to get rid of. So now there's a number of different brushes you can use to get rid of these kinds of seams, and the one I like using the most is something I'll call a cloner. Now before I show you what that is, let me show you some of the other brush possibilities that you can use. So the first thing you might try is a regular sort of hard-edged brush, and if you use this to clone with, you get rid of the seam here, but the problem is you start getting seams on the two sides of where your brush was, which makes sense because your brush is pretty hard-edged, so of course you're going to get seams at that hard edge on these two sides. So you start off with one seam and now you have two seams, which is really not what you want. So the next possibility is to get a softer brush like this guy here. The problem with the soft brush, it does a better job, but around the edges of the brush you get this sort of blurry, smeary kind of effect. And it makes sense, you know, when you're cloning here, you are in these spots cloning 50% of your cloned image, 50% of the image below it. So you're bound to get some artifacts, and the artifacts will get worse the more you clone, and so your final image might end up looking a little soft, which may not be what you're after. So what I like doing is using a cloner brush. Here are my set of cloner brushes that I have, and I'll pick one of them, say this guy here. And all these brushes they're odd-shaped brushes which I modify using shape dynamics to have a random size jitter and a random angle jitter, so that the edge is always irregular. Now, when you use this brush to get rid of these edges, you see that you don't have the problem with the hard edge, but at the same time you also don't have the problem with the blurriness because this is a hard-edged brush. It just has a rather strange edge to it. Now, here's the image before I use this technique to get rid of the seam. And here it is after I've gotten rid of the seam, after about a minute of using the clone tool. Now the last step I usually do, which you don't have to do, but I like doing it, is going to the offset filter and then doing the negative to the offset transform you made, which puts it back to where it was originally, which, as I said, you don't have to do it, but I like having the original image back where it was at the beginning.